Hola, buenas tardes. We are going to start with the communications. Here is Oliver Coulson from the Brown University, who is going to present polychromy and symbolic order in the angel roofs of East Anglia.
Thank you. Well, hola, bonjour, guten Tag, hello. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. Can you all hear me at the back? I presume you can. I'm making a funny noise. I'm going to begin my presentation by discussing the first angel roof at Westminster Hall in London in connection with the patronage of King Richard II. I'll introduce the theologian John Wycliffe and his heretical followers, known as Lollards. I will then discuss the spread of angel sculptures outside London, focusing on the case study of the Church of St Agnes at Corston in Norfolk. I believe the colour scheme and iconography of the angels at St Agnes were intended to reinforce the concept of a divinely ordered hierarchy in the face of Lollard rejections of the established church. The first hammer beam roof to be carved with angels, so the first angel roof, was built in 1399 for the English King Richard II at Westminster Hall in London. Existing scholarship has focused on defining angel roofs as a type of architectural sculpture. Less attention, however, has been devoted to contemplating the wider environments in which these sculptures existed, both in terms of architectural space and also in terms of contemporary atmospheres of viewing. By the late 14th century, England was gripped by widespread fear of heresy. In addition to rejecting the doctrine of transubstantiation and undermining the status of the clergy, John Wycliffe, the Oxford theologian denounced as a heretic, cautioned against inappropriate devotion to images, as shown in this quote. Wycliffe's words heralded a debate about the role of art in religion, inspiring the growth of the heretical Lollard movement and leading hundreds to be burnt at the stake for their beliefs. In 1395, while its angel roof was under construction, a Lollard manifesto, known as the 12 Conclusions, was nailed to the doors of Westminster Hall. The 12th conclusion called for the abolition of art. The manifesto states, quote, "The abundance of unnecessary arts practiced in our realm nourishes much sin in waste, profusion, and disguise," before exhorting the reader to full-blown iconoclasm. Quote, "All kinds of arts should be destroyed for the increase of virtue." The Westminster angels, carved horizontally around the hammer beams, hold Richard II's coat of arms. From the multitudes of angels here in the Wilton diptych to the cherubic figures that flung golden leaves and coins before the king during his coronation procession, Richard styled himself as a man who was most comfortable in the company of angels. The king's coronation even culminated with the crown being placed on the monarch's head by a mechanical angel. The angels in the Wilton diptych all wear badges showing Richard II's emblem of a white deer, white hart, mirroring the contemporary aristocratic practice of dressing a noble's retinue in matching livery. Given Richard II's angelic affinity, the emblem-bearing angels at Westminster Hall can be understood as an extension of the king's personal entourage. Richard II's tomb epitaph states, "He crushed heretics and laid low their friends," and a book was written for the monarch by a Dominican called Roger Dimmock, specifically to refute the Lollard 12 Conclusions manifesto. The king was clearly keen to make heretic crushing a major part of his legacy. As angel roofs began to be built outside London, in East Anglia, a residual memory of the king's anti-heretic credentials may have endured through the king's association with the iconography of angels. Although the vitality of the Lollard heresy waxed and waned between the 1390s and the onset of the Henrician Reformation in the early 16th century, trial records indicate that in eastern England, certainly, the church took the threat of Lollard nonconformity very seriously. This map shows angel-roofed churches with pins showing the places where people who lived who were tried for heresy in the Diocese of Norwich between 1428 and 1431. The first angel roof outside London was built at Lynn in Norfolk. A priest from the town, William Saltrey, was the first Lollard to be burnt in England as a heretic in 1401. There is an interesting overlap then between pockets of heretical belief and the building of angel roof sculptures. After this first angel roof was built in Lynn, these sculptures proliferate across East Anglia during the 15th century. Roughly 145 of the 169 known examples are sited within these most easterly counties of England. The East Anglian bias of these spectacular assertions of angelic presence may represent what was felt to be a necessary statement of faith to stem the spread of local Lollard incredulity. So what about colour? That's what we're here to discuss, right? So, the angel roof at the Church of St Agnes in Corston, Norfolk, probably dates to around 1430, when activities against heresy in the region were at their height. The angels in this roof are arranged in 2 registers. In the upper register, there are 5 pairs of angels, 1 on each hammer post of the roof. To give a sense of scale, these standing angels are about my height. The angels have 2 pairs of wings, indicating that they represent a higher order of angels, so seraphim, cherubim, or thrones. In the lower order, 3 angels appear between each hammer beam. These angels have 1 pair of wings, signifying a lower order of angel. And the concept of a hierarchy of angels was well established in England by this time. In the 6th century, Gregory the Great had outlined the concept of 9 orders of angels, and Gregory's ideas were elaborated upon by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century in his Summa Theologica. The angels at St Agnes were repaired in the 19th century, but they retained their original 15th century paint. The restorers did not repaint the sculptures, instead leaving new wood bare. This forward-thinking approach allows us to imagine for ourselves how eye-catching the colour scheme would have been in its original intensity. The sculpture has a white ground, over which we see red chevrons denoting feathers. All over the body of the angel, we see green-gold circles, which imitate the eyes of peacock feathers. These eyes call to mind the depictions of archangels, such as this very fine angel standing in judgment on Roger van der Weyden's Burn altarpiece. I speculate that the angels at St Agnes were also intended to be understood as angels of judgment. As representatives from the first and most powerful sphere of angels, the cherubim in the upper register are most closely associated with the justice and authority of God. At St Agnes, the angelic hierarchy spearheads an assault on the senses with a feast for the eyes. I suggest that the white, red, and green-gold paint may interpret the cherubim of Ezekiel's visions of judgment. The angelic vision in Ezekiel 10 reads, quote, "In the midst of the living creatures a bright fire, and lightning going forth from the fire." Verse 18 continues, "And the whole body was full of eyes round about all the 4. It's possible that the peacock eyes that appear all over the bodies of the cherubim at St Agnes relate to this vision. The sense of sight is one of several senses that are stimulated by the colours of these angels. Ezekiel's vision also describes the sound of the angels. Quote, "I heard the noise of their wings like the noise of many waters, as it were the voice of the Most High God. When they walked, it was like the voice of a multitude, like the voice of an army." The colour scheme of the cherubim at Corston, coupled with the sight of the outspread helicopter-like wings of these sculptures, may well have brought to mind the awesome sounds described in this biblical passage. When activated by the sounds, smells, and taste surrounding the ritual of the Mass, the sight of angel roof sculpture made the often terrifying wonder of God present in a fleeting moment, as described here in Revelations. And while we're on this slide, notice the relative similarity of the hand gesture of Van der Weyden's Angel of Judgment, and you can compare it with the cherubim at St. Agnes. While being slightly more visually accessible, the position of the lowest order of angels at the base of the roof offers a physical reminder that all of these angels are members of God's kingdom. There's no possibility at all of haptic interaction with the congregation below. So why would we need angels of judgment arranged in a hierarchical composition in the roof of this East Anglian church? The sights and sounds accompanying the congregation on their journey to partake in the Eucharist culminated in the stimulation of what was arguably the most intimate of all the senses when they tasted the body and blood of Christ. Lollards did not believe in transubstantiation. They also rejected the sacraments, reserving special ire for the Eucharist. When I first saw an angel roof, Roger van der Weyden's Seven Sacraments altarpiece immediately came to mind. In this painting, an angel appears above each of the sacraments taking place in the church. Catholic doctrine states that angels are present at Mass. As Mass was sung and the host raised beneath the roof at St. Agnes, the colourful angels would have kept the flavour of salvation alive in worshippers' minds. As in Van der Weyden's painting, these angels at St. Agnes are a physical assertion of the centrality of the Eucharistic sacrament to the Christian faith. What better way to reassert that doctrine than to make the otherwise insensible sacred matter of angels sensible, an aim that deeply troubled Wycliffe and the Lollards. For example, Wycliffe wrote, quote, "Not only laymen, but ecclesiastical superiors err in faith, thinking angels to be corporeal." The gustatory climax of the Mass was the final layer of a carefully orchestrated programme of sensory assault, which guided lay worshippers towards salvation, ensuring they did not fall foul of these watchful angels of judgment above. I want to conclude by mentioning a caveat about the colour of these angel roofs before posing a question to you. At this point, I have a sad confession. Most angel roofs are not colourful. It's likely that some were never painted, while others have lost their original paint to the vagaries of the damp English climate. To end, I've come across an interesting statement suggesting that King Henry VI believed that colours had inherent symbolic value. Describing the new seal of King's College, Cambridge in 1449, he writes, quote, "Our newly founded college, lasting for ages to come, whose perpetuity we wish to be signified by the stability of the black colour, may bring forth the brightest flowers redolent of every kind of knowledge." So black signifies stability there. So my parting question for you all then, all of the painted angel roofs I've seen have a similar colour palette, white, red, green and gold. Did these colours then themselves impart any symbolic meaning to angel roof sculptures? Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. We are going to continue with Nicoletta Fazio from the Museum of Islamic Art of Doha with the title Rainbow Bride and the Black Sun, Love and Its Colors in the Roman de la Rose and Niẓāmī's Laylī va Majnūn. Well, sorry for that.
Buenas tardes a todos y gracias por la invitación, and that's where my Spanish ends. No, well, joking aside, that's actually quite nice to be here in person. That's my first conference since 2019 with a live audience, so it's quite nice, yet a bit bizarre, I would say. Okay, so let's start. Yeah, I'd like to start with this quote from Lettres L'Union by Jean-Paul Sartre, and I quote, Autrui me regarde et comme tel, il détient les secrets de mon être. Il sait ce que je suis. Ainsi, le sein profond de mon être est hors de moi, emprisonné dans une absence. Autrui abat sur moi. So, suspend judgment here. I know that pairing pre-modern love poetry, as I will be discussing, with the words of a French existentialist philosopher and notorious womanizer can be a tad pretentious, but I see that this passage, at least to me, encapsulates the experience of love as portrayed in the poem that I will shortly discuss. The beloved as a radical otherness, a mirror, we can say, by which the lovers knows and through which loses themselves. And as we shall see, I hope, this mirror can turn delightfully colorful and up to complete chromatic absorption to black. The Roman de la Rose needs no introduction. Completed around the 1275 and 1280 Common Era, it is a long and at times tiresome allegorical poem in the form of a dream allegory and a dream vision. In a nutshell, it is about a lover struggle to conquer the love of a rosebud. That's the very tenuous plot line. The poem was hugely successful. Hundreds of manuscripts have survived, many of which illustrated, quite richly illustrated in some cases. Today, I'd like to focus on one particular illustration that opens basically all the manuscript which has been illustrated of the rose, and this with very few exceptions. In many cases, this illustration provides a visual induction into the matter of this allegorical dream vision. And despite a fistful of verses, which I listed here, painters created rich and complex iconography to return the poem's oniric dimension. And I think it also quite important to keep in mind that in some cases, this would have been the only image that the reader would encounter as they flip through the pages of this manuscript. So the illustration I'd like to focus today is this one, which is from manuscript, a French manuscript from the mid-14th century, most probably made for the aristocratic family of Poitiers-Melun, and the coat of arms, it's here. Can you see? Yeah. So we are talking about a fairly wealthy manuscript commission. The page arrangement, which is a frontispiece of a four-lobed compartment, is a usual one for manuscript of that time. What we behold in this specific compartment, that's the first compartment, is a sort of meeting point between the actuality of the narration of the dream vision, the sleeping lover, or the narrator, and that's a little bit of a difficulty to understand who is talking when in the poem, while we are offered at the same time a glimpse into the dream vision, and it's the rose bush and the birds that appear later in the poem. The rainbow-striped curtains can be considered at first a decorative device, and they also recur in other manuscripts from the same period, not only manuscripts of the Roman de la Rose. However, when put in dialogue with the poetic text and its intellectual background, we might access a further level of interpretation. So, The Rose is a poem whose plot consistently relies on visual encounters to proceed. The description of such optical phenomena drew from discourses of natural philosophy by authorities of the time, such as William of Conques from the School of Chartres. William of Conques developed a highly influential theory for allegorical interpretation based on the concept of integumentum, which is a Latin word literally meaning covering or wrapping. The word stands for the act of covering through allegorical language, which is highly used in the Roman de la Rose. and the figurative meaning behind the veil of language. So there is also this tension of like what language reveals and covers at the same time. Integumentum as a curtaining veil, precisely a colorful veil that covers and displays at the same time, appears in the description of the gown of nature, like the allegorical figure of nature in the Planctu Naturae, the complaint of nature, by Alanus de Lille, died in 1202. And as obscure as this poem can be today, it was actually a quite influential piece of literature, especially among writers of the time, most notably Geoffrey Chaucer and the authors of the Roman de la Rose, especially its second author, Jean de Meaux. The echo of Alanus de Planctu is audible also in the description of the robe worn by Amors, the god of love, that the lover encounters along its way as he enters the dreamed garden. And these are like excerpts from the Planctu Naturae and here the Roman de la Rose and its translation. An equally lively and colorful image appears at the beginning of the rose in the description of the renewal of nature gowns, like nature, during spring. And here highlighted in red are the passage. On a linguistic level, words such as dress and colors have been used by medieval rhetoricians to indicate figural language and rhetorical tropes. And one example is, for instance, Geoffrey de Vinceau, around 1200, that use, for instance, terms such as flowers and colors to express the rhetorics of language. According to literary historian Claire Nouvet, the colors of nature dress in the rose function as markers of their own fictional characters as rhetorical device. They, and I quote, metaphorize the rhetorical colors that compose the allegorical dress that the text implicitly claims to be. Nature's dress is indeed the first of a series of dresses. These dresses thematize within the text the allegorical dress, in quotation mark, that the text as a whole claims to be, end quotes. Colors thus play an important role in the rose, as they appear in topical moments of the narrative. When the lover, for instance, discovered the rosebud in the water reflection, and this is a very key point in the narrative. Or, for instance, in the description, as I mentioned before, of the robe of Amors, that somehow anticipate the shimmering and colorful reflection of the fountain of Narcissus, where the lover sees the rose reflection. And that's a quite faithful rendering of this experience, with the light shining and hitting the eye of the lovers and the water surface. So a mesmerizing display of colors stands between the lover and his beloved rose. And having said that, I would like to return again to this first image that I showed and ask if beyond mere fashionable decor that this striped textile might have, do they also hold deeper meanings? Well, we can speculate that the curtains can indeed represent, in this specific case, the multicolored integumentum of covering lifted up when the sleeping narrator turns into the active dreamer and access a different plane of reality. Or it could stand for a metaphor for the whole poem, literally wrapping its creator as it experiences its very creation, the dream. The beloved that materialize in a rainbow of color, which are literally the attempt of light to become visible. So now let's move eastward and see what happened on an opposite side. And here we go. Around 1180, so 40 years before the first author of the Rose, Guillaume de Lory, penned the first part of the poem, the Persian poet Niẓāmī Ganjavi, from his birthplace, the city of Ganje in modern Azerbaijan, completed Laylī va Majnūn, which is the third Masnavi, a narrative poem in a group of 5 called usually the Khamsa, the quintet. The poem retells in Persian, in classical Persian, the tragic story of 2 ill-fated lovers from the early Islamic period, Majnūn, which literally means the madman, and his beloved Laylī. It has often been erroneously dubbed the Romeo and Juliet of the Arab world, and this is because it originally stems out of the Arabic poetic tradition. The story is actually very simple. Again, we have a very thin plot. Boy meets girl, family not impressed, boy goes mad. They both eventually die tragically, but they don't commit suicide, and they don't consummate their love, which is a very key point. So, in Niẓāmī's poem, the lovers fall in love through exchange of glances. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to go back. Yeah. With the beloved Laylī progressively taken out of sight, so to say, receding within the confined space of the tent to safeguard her from the scandal of an inappropriate love. There is a textual association between Laylī and her concealed condition, the veil indicated as pardeh here in red, which means literally the curtain, being a metaphor for her social segregation and for the secrecy of her sorrow, as apparent in few images here. For instance, here and here, always shielded by tent and textiles. The image of the veil has been extensively used in classical Persian poetry as a powerful symbol for a panoply of meanings. Medieval Persian poets used the veil as symbolically refers to the blackness of the night, a detail that I think we should keep in mind since the name Laylī and the word Layl, night in Arabic, are basically homographs. Indeed, one major physical trait of Laylī is her dark violet mane, whose lock enthralls Majnūn, and the similitude between the hair of the beloved and the veil that hides and protects the secret of her face has been a popular one, most prominently used by Hafiz Shirazi in the 14th century. Finally, in Niẓāmī, Laylī is associated to religious images, becoming the qutb, the pole, and the mihrab, the prayer niche in Majnūn's life. There is a point where all these images that I just discussed converge and merge into one another, and this is the holy site of the Kaaba, the fulcrum of the Islamic religious life. Majnūn is brought to Mecca to cure his love sickness, and it is in here, in front of the Kaaba, that he asks God to increase his love for Laylī. And there are plenty of illustrations like these ones from the 14th century, early 14th century. The one I actually would like to focus on is from the late 15th century, and that's this one. And it's from one, it has been attributed to one of the most celebrated painters of his time, Behzad, active in Herat during the last quarter of the 15th century. And it's from the manuscript of the Khamsa, active, made by, for the last Timurid prince, Sultan Hussein by Qara. And the slender towering building of the Kaaba appears to mimic the slender, perfect body of the beloved, with Majnūn actually stretching one of his arms to reach the door knocker and the black kiswa, which is the textile covering the Kaaba. The body of the Kaaba becomes a black screen, literally, over which the body of the beloved is projected. Indeed, in Niẓāmī's, the dark hair of Laylī comes to resemble the kiswa of the Kaaba, while her curly locks are compared to the door knocker of the Kaaba itself, which Majnūn is actually holding here. Anthropomorphic traits and sensuous, almost sensual images have in turn been used to describe the Kaaba. And we don't need to bring up a particularly spiritually imbued text to find description that likened the building to a beautiful bride. And these are two examples from Ibn Battuta and Ibn Jubayr, so travel memoirs and secular literature. In this illustration, the black kiswa, it's hiding and enhancing the beauty of the Kaaba and becomes the screen against which the beloved emerge. The black curtain, the veil between the lover and the beloved, the luminous black hair of the beloved. In this glossy darkness, in the luminous night of Laylī, the lovers see the beloved. It is what in mystical thoughts has been identified with the concept of the Nuri Siyai, the black light, or the black sun, the color of Jalal, the boundless divine majesty. So, in conclusion, I would like to make here 3 points. First, this poem focuses on what can be called the heroism of the sentiment due to their highly psychological dimension. Action actually happens at the level of emotion, and this is in contrast to the heroism of action of the chanson de geste genre. And second, the love relation is always appeared to be mediated for the loving subject. And coded in the language of Finamore, in the rose, love is an idealized experience, yet it maintains the vibrancy of the material world and its color. In Niẓāmī, Laylī, Majnūn, love can manifest as a paradoxical darkness, a bewildering experience, and a contradiction in terms. Lastly, the examples presented today are 2 moments in a centuries-long history for these manuscript traditions. So each manuscript stands as a unicum, and these illustrations are singular emergences, unique translation of the poetic matters into visual means. However, under the veils of the oblique language of poetry, over and over again, these romances and their illustration cover and reveal truths about desire, loss, otherness, and discovery of one's own selves in the mirror of the poetic experience of love. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to listen now to Holy Flora from the Tulane University with the communication lead white as transformative material in Cimabue's Assisi murals.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers of this wonderful conference who are especially impressive in their speed in organizing this wonderful event. It's also my first conference in person since 2019, so I'm happy to be here. Scholars have long lamented the ruined condition of the murals painted by Cimabue in the apse and transepts of the upper church of the Basilica of St. Francis at Assisi. Depicting scenes from the Apocalypse, the life, death, and assumption of the Virgin Mary, the 4 evangelists, and the apostles, the murals were painted circa 1290, and circa 1280 rather, and by the time Giorgio Vasari saw them in 1563, they had already been consumed, as he said, by time and dust. Cimabue's paintings likely deteriorated long before that, however, due to his working methods. Painting mostly a secco rather than in buon fresco, which is why his paintings should be properly called murals, not frescoes, he made liberal use of lead white pigment, which later reacted with sulfur in the air and corroded, darkening and obscuring his compositions. The chemical change in the lead white produced an almost complete chromatic reversal. The modeling and chiaroscuro of Cimabue's paintings are thus somewhat better comprehended in negative photographs, such as this one. Until now, there has been no investigation into why Cimabue used so much ill-fated lead white. His employment of lead white as a paint pigment in itself was nothing new, but his heavy reliance on it for wall paintings was distinctive. Painters of Cimabue's generation most often used it on panels or in manuscript illumination, and in fact, artists' treatises warn that it has the potential to turn black when used on walls. Choosing to ignore such advice, Cimabue applied lead white over large areas of his murals, layering it on the faces of his figures and their drapery, as well as the architecture surrounding them. In this paper, I argue that Cimabue, in collaboration with his Franciscan patrons at Assisi, may have preferred lead white because of the symbolic potential of the transformative process involved in its manufacture. My approach to Cimabue's lead white at Assisi is inspired by broader scholarly discussions about the nature of materials and the idea that processes involved in their making impacted the ways that patrons and artists deployed them. Medieval exegetes allegorized the means of producing materials, particularly metals. It was therefore important for authors of technical treatises on art of the period to note means of chemical and color changes when writing about the making of materials. Lead white was manufactured in a process that transformed dark metal into white powder, a process Cennino Cennini's treatise of circa 1390 describes as alchemical. The Franciscans in the 13th century, exemplified in the writings of natural philosopher and friar Roger Bacon, were interested in the potential of alchemy and its role in Christian salvation. In receiving the stigmata, St. Francis himself had also experienced the mystical alteration of matter in his own flesh, a process compared by his biographers to the refinement of metals. For the friars then at Assisi, the alchemical process used to make lead white amplified its symbolic value. My connection of Cimabue's use of plentiful lead white at Assisi to the spiritual interests of the friars at the Sacro Convento at Assisi must be speculative on some level, for we have no documents at all as to the commission for Cimabue's murals. Based on the evidence from the few surviving contracts from the period, however, we can assume that the desired aesthetic effects and budgetary limits of the project would have been discussed. Lead white was among the least expensive and easiest pigments to procure, but so was the other commonly most used lead white for walls, lime white or bianco di San Giovanni. Thus, we cannot dismiss Cimabue's choice of abundant lead white as a merely practical or choice or one directly connected to the bubbling tensions in the order surrounding the observance of Franciscan poverty. We can imagine, however, that Cimabue's discussions with the friars over the complicated theological ideas expressed in the iconography of his murals may also have led to talk of materials in terms of their ideological potential. After a brief introduction to Cimabue's exceptional reliance on lead white, my paper will move to a discussion of the Franciscan interest in alchemy and its potential in spiritual transformation. As previously mentioned, lead white in itself was not unusual at all as a painting material. It had been employed in European mural painting for centuries. Prior to Cimabue's arrival at Assisi, the Maestro di San Francesco applied it in the lower basilica to embellish his murals narrating the life of St. Francis, dating to the 1260s. But other 13th century painters used the pigment sparingly. They did not spread lead white abundantly throughout their compositions the way Cimabue did. The Maestro di San Francesco, for example, restricted his lead white to the highlights on faces and bodies, as you can see here. For other whites in his composition, such as the cloth underneath the dead Christ here, he used lime white, also known as bianco di San Giovanni, the more common choice for white on walls. Cimabue instead applied lead white in broad strokes on faces as well as drapery, frequently layering it over primary colors, as you can see here. Cimabue's heavy reliance on lead white in this way directly contradicts advice given by artistic treatises such as Cennino's that warn that it can turn black when applied on walls. What then might have prompted Cimabue's risky choice? Some insight can be found in the description of lead white in Cennino's treatise. Cennino states that lead white, also known as biacca, is formed alchemically, thus through a dramatic chemical transformation. Medieval recipes for making lead white detail this process. Strips of lead are sprinkled with urine or vinegar, then enclosed in a wooden container and buried under horse dung. After a few months, a white crust forms on the metal, which is dried and then ground. And here's a more modern rendition of the making of lead white. This technique produces a pigment with an unmatched whiteness. Cennino describes lead white as focosa, a word that is often translated from the Italian as brilliant, but can also mean fiery. He likely means that the bright white powder, formed from metal, reflects light to a greater degree than the calcite-based lime white, more typically used on walls. What in today's scientific terms we would call the refractive index for lead white is much higher than that of lime white, the more stable pigment Cimino recommends for walls. It is its derivation from lead that gives bianca its potential for splendor, much in the way that manufactured lead crystal shines. Although Cimabue would not have known the modern concept of a refractive index, it is likely that he understood that lead produced a brilliant white that would add great luster and enhance the play of light on the walls at Assisi. But the friars at Assisi may have further valued lead white's symbolic potential as a transformed substance. Treatises on natural philosophy and on art making from the 13th and 14th centuries underscore the fact that profound physical change occurs in the making of bianca. In multiple sources, as we have seen in Cimino's treatise, the making of lead white is connected specifically to alchemy. In his 13th century book of Minerals, Albertus Magnus cites ancient alchemical knowledge as he details the making of lead white. Quote, "And Hermes, who had proved much about the transmutations of metals, in his alchemy reports that if plates of lead are suspended over a vessel containing much strong vinegar, so that the vapor of the vinegar is continually in contact with the lead plates, the vapor will condense and destroy the substance of the lead and change it into a white powder that is called cerussa." Unquote. Albertus makes it clear that the substance of the lead is totally changed in the alchemical metamorphosis. The resulting material is pure, white. Albertus states that the bits of powder that appear on the surface of the lead plates, quote, "grow whiter because they are more thoroughly purified." A kindred connection between white pigments and alchemy is seen in a treatise by the Franciscan friar Bonaventura da Iseo, who died in 1273. In his Liber Compostela writes, quote, "A man expert in this kind of art, called alchymia, knows how to make many things from the beginning if he wants, like silver and gold, salt, precious stones, dyes, and colors like azure, cinnabar, white, verdigris, lacquer, and so on." End quote. At the time Bonaventura was writing, the study of alchemy in Europe was shaped by the Augustinian idea that all living things, including matter, are created by God, but most remain seeds and thus need to have their transformative potential unlocked. Alchemy was believed to have the power to enable this potential. How then might the Franciscan interest in alchemy relate to Cimabue's extensive use of alchemical lead white at Assisi? The idea that bianca was an alchemically made, purified, and changed substance would have made it ideologically appropriate for embellishing the Assisi apse and transepts, particularly the apocalypse scenes located in the north transept. As seen in the writings of the Franciscan Roger Bacon, natural philosophers in Europe in the 13th century viewed alchemy in eschatological terms, wanting to harness the abilities of transmutation to perfect bodies and save souls. In the wake of the apocalyptic prophecies of the 12th century monk Joachim of Fiore, there was widespread belief that the apocalypse could be imminent. Although Joachim's prophecies were officially declared heretical, the Franciscans and other mendicant orders continued to see themselves as active participants in the realization of St. John's apocalyptic vision. Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, the Minister General of the Franciscan Order, whose biography was declared the official one of St. Francis in 1266, compared Francis to the angel of the sixth seal of the apocalypse. Cimabue depicted this angel as the focal point of his apocalypse cycle on the north transept wall at Assisi. The central scene here shows the angel of the sixth seal flying above a walled city, guarded by personifications of the four winds. Although most of the figure here has been lost, some scholars believed that this angel was depicted as Francis himself, shown with the stigmata, the wounds that Bonaventure likened to apocalyptic seals. Cimabue further illustrates the immediate relevance of the apocalypse to the Franciscan order in the following scene showing the opening of the sixth seal, in which Franciscan friars kneel below the apocalyptic Christ, witnesses to and participants in his ultimate triumph over evil. Alchemy was also understood as a potential weapon in this apocalyptic spiritual warfare. Roger Bacon, better known for his treatises on optics, was among the most vocal advocates of using alchemy to create tools to be used against Antichrist. Among other things, Roger developed a formula for an ingestible elixir that would prolong human life in the hopes that more souls could be saved before the impending end times. Bacon asserted that rays emanating from celestial bodies were essential to the activation of this elixir. Divine light and energy combined with alchemical knowledge enabled physical and spiritual metamorphosis. With the elixir, Bacon proposed to bring the human body closer to that of the perfect resurrected body, the body of Adam before the fall. The elixir was to transform a human's appearance, as well as his or her moral character and ability to understand God's wisdom. Inward perfection manifested as outward luminosity in this paradisical body. Franciscan theological writings of the period show a kindred interest in this notion of physical purification as a sign of Francis's sanctity. Saintly bodies, even as they remained on earth, were believed to be the same perfected bodies as the resurrected bodies in heaven. Both of Francis's biographers, Thomas of Celano and later Bonaventure, in describing the aftermath of Francis's death, noted how the saint's body radiated this kind of heavenly splendor. Significantly, this purified body was believed to increase in whiteness. Bonaventure marvels at how, after his death, quote, Francis's skin, which before was inclined to be dark, both naturally and from his illness, now shone with a dazzling whiteness, prefiguring the beauty of that glorious second stole, end quote. Second stole Bonaventure refers to here is the biblical notion of the garment of salvation that will be given to those in heaven. The pallor of the body of Francis in Giotto's Bardi Chapel fresco here, depicting the death of Francis, illuminates this kind of sanctity. Bonaventure also points out the contrast between Francis's white skin and the black nails of his stigmata. Quote, the nails appeared black against his shining skin, so that it is no wonder that the onlookers were amazed and overjoyed at the sight of such varied and miraculous beauty, end quote. At Assisi, Cimabue applied a thick layer of lead white to the hands of Francis, shown kneeling at the foot of the cross here, creating the chromatic contrast that would further underscore Francis's holiness. Francis's sanctity engendered a purifying, transformative physical process akin to that intended in the alchemical production of Bacon's elixir. Seems appropriate, then, for Cimabue to have applied heavy layers of alchemically created lead white to his murals at Assisi. His choice to use lead white on walls, as risky as it was, suggests that he reached towards visual effects with larger exegetical goals, likely in collaboration with his Franciscan patrons. Examining the wider implications for Cimabue's choice of lead white helps us to see him beyond the traditional narrative of stylistic innovation and pre-Renaissance quest for naturalism for which he's known. We can instead see this pivotal period in the history of art as one in where splendor and other worldly effects were equally sought, and materials could evoke spiritual and physical metamorphosis. Thank you.
Bueno, antes de nada, ¿se me oye bien? Ah, vale. Sí. Muchas gracias al comité organizador y a vosotros, asistentes, oyentes. Comenzamos. Voy a ir un poco rápido, lo siento, pero es que son muchas cosas. Me disculpo de antemano. Bien, una estética construida del caos. Vamos a comenzar explicando el color, que es un elemento comunicativo que nos arroja información, ¿verdad? En este caso nos va a servir para arrojar algo de información al estudio que estoy llevando a cabo del tema de mi tesis, el cual lleva por título Cosmos, Orden y Caos en el Arte y Literatura Medievales. Nada, unas pinceladas para ir todos juntos, ¿de acuerdo? Cosmos sería esa visión, ¿vale?, de un mundo creado por Dios, ya está. Orden y caos están aludiendo a unas denominaciones que en ningún momento son sinónimos del bien y el mal. Esas concepciones nos estarían hablando ya de una ideología, de una comprensión, de una concepción del mundo antropológica, que no tiene lugar, no tiene cabida en una cosmovisión, ¿vale?, que ha sido creada por Dios. Bien. Entonces, por lo tanto, nos estamos aproximando a unas ideas, ¿vale?, a unas imágenes visuales, las cuales se oponen para instruir, para servir de orientación al fiel, al individuo. El individuo, el cual es el objeto por el que comienza a cambiar la mentalidad en los siglos XII y XIII. Vamos a ver si me deja cambiar. Ahí. Bien. En los siglos XII y XIII todos sabemos, ¿no?, que hay un cambio de concepción en esta cosmovisión, donde hay una corriente de pensamiento platónico que pasa a ser más aristotélico y, por lo tanto, las estructuras sociales, la misma reconfiguración y consideración del hombre se altera. Es por ello que para, en este caso, aproximarnos al caos, he escogido estas obras, las cuales están dentro de este arco cronológico del siglo XII-XIII, y aunque el caos vaya mucho más allá de lo que es la iconografía, el tema de los infiernos, sí que es verdad que a la hora de hablar de la policromía, de la cantidad, ¿no?, de la conservación que poseemos, se encuentra más en estas grandes portadas y, sobre todo, si no se conserva la capa original, si bien se conserva o se han hecho estudios. Bien. Antes de nada, me gustaría repasar muy rápidamente, aunque ya lo habrán hecho mis compañeros y compañeras mil veces mejor que yo, ¿vale? Simplemente esa simbología, ese significado que nos da cada uno, ¿no? Hablamos del amarillo, ¿no? A partir del siglo XIII nos hablaría ya de la locura, ¿no? Nos estamos refiriendo ahí a connotaciones negativas, ¿verdad? Aún así sería el color que más destaca perceptivamente. El verde, que nos habla de una estabilidad, de una movilidad, de un cambio, el cual alude, ¿no?, a ese poliformismo, a esa característica de Satán, ¿no? Bien, el rojo, a la hora de aproximarnos al rojo nos está hablando de nuevos valores sociales y con ello también sí que se alude al fuego, pero también nos está hablando de una dimensión de la guerra, de la violencia, de esa sangre, ¿no? Estamos viendo ya, ¿no?, unos planteamientos en los que nos estamos aproximando, ¿vale?, a referentes naturales. Se están haciendo unos discursos donde la percepción y la representación van, empiezan a ir de la mano, ese naturalismo, ¿verdad? Bien, el azul, mi compañero que me va a proseguir va a hablar mucho mejor de ello, pero reitero, bueno, la idea de que cómo ese azul va tomando un cariz diferente al que ha tenido en estos siglos bajomedievales y comienza a ser una representación del dominio sagrado, ¿vale?, del orden, puesto que tiene un nuevo valor para la sociedad. Los colores oscuros, ¿no?, que ya con esa analogía de los elementos naturales nos recuerdan a la sociedad, a lo pantanoso, ¿no?, los abismos. Bien, con el negro y el blanco hago un pequeño paréntesis, puesto que ya en el Génesis se hace, esa comparación con la luz y las tinieblas. Pero a la hora de aproximarnos realmente, por ejemplo, a el blanco, en ningún momento en la Edad Media tiene ese matiz, esa simbología que luego, posteriormente, sí se va a desarrollar, que alude al bien, ¿verdad? Sin embargo, en el negro, cuando estamos hablando del negro, estamos hablando de un color que niega, de la nada. De hecho, le quita el significado al resto de colores. Bien. Bien, Conques, Francia. Problema, cuando nos aproximamos a Conques, cuando hablamos de la capa original, solo a través de los estudios y de esta reconstrucción que hicieron las diferentes instituciones, que por falta de tiempo no menciono, nos encontramos que únicamente se han podido datar, ¿no?, estas policromías. Sin embargo, en el 2012 se lleva a cabo, mediante un proyecto, esta recreación virtual en la que, bueno, se nos plantea este escenario. Importante, cuando estamos hablando de este tímpano, nos fijamos siempre se ha estudiado en la historiografía artística que hay una contraposición entre bien y mal, porque es a lo que alude el cielo y el infierno, pero, sin embargo, cuando nos aproximamos a la cosmovisión de bajo medieval, nos estamos encontrando que realmente nos está hablando del discurso escatológico, de la salvación del fiel. Nos está diciendo básicamente lo que le va a pasar, si se va con los salvados o con los condenados. Realmente aquí no hay una contraposición entre bien y mal. Cristo, ahí en Pantocrátor, está presidiendo todo el tímpano y hay una homogeneidad de los elementos. Bien, en cuanto a la recreación virtual, lo que plantean los expertos, los diferentes profesionales, sería unas tonalidades verdes para esos seres infernales, pero hay que hacer un pequeño paréntesis. Estamos hablando de un tímpano románico, ¿vale? Que al menos se mueve a través de ese tratamiento, de ese lenguaje. Bien, cuando hablamos de estos seres, de estas representaciones, tenemos que verlo con los ojos románicos. Estamos hablando de valores, de verdades espirituales. No nos estamos refiriendo a un naturalismo, una figuración representativa bajo la iconografía, aunque se estudie bajo esos parámetros. Bien, cuando nos enfrentamos a los seres infernales, en ninguno de los momentos se nos está proponiendo que pertenezcan, no tienen un espacio como tal. Sí que es verdad que se va a ir desarrollando a través de la Edad Media, obviamente, pero cuando encontramos una serie de estos seres, lo que propone, por ejemplo, el profesor Portal sería que tienen una cierta relación con de la simbología, ¿no?, de estos colores, una relación por la cual estos seres llegarían a interpelar al hombre mediante los elementos naturales, mediante el plano terrenal, que sería en el que se mueve, ¿vale? Por lo tanto, encontraríamos, una asociación entre, por ejemplo, el agua y el verde, el color rojo, el fuego, la tierra, el negro, y se me olvida uno, el azul con el aire. Bien, si bien estos son capas posteriores de la policromía, yo apuntaría que al menos la tonalidad se ha ido repintando o ha ido más o menos respetando ciertos colores. Y no sería tan unificado, ¿no?, ya estos espacios infernales. Bien. Una comparación que pondría sería, para entender ese contexto simbólico del románico, sería la representación de las almas. Estas almas son torturadas, ¿no?, pero realmente no son materiales, no tienen esa dimensión del dolor. Sin embargo, es una analogía, ¿vale?, para aludir a la idea de que las almas no ven a Dios, que es lo peor que le podía pasar al fiel, ¿vale? Estaba condenado a la no visión de Dios. Bien. El profesor Portal también propone una regla de oposiciones entre el mismo significado de los mismos colores, que uno tendría una connotación positiva y otra negativa. Entendemos, ¿no?, que cuando hablamos de términos simbólicos nos estamos moviendo en términos muy matizados, de verdades matizadas que no son tan absolutas, no hay una polarización, ¿vale?, de los valores, de las potencias, de las fuerzas. Cuando nos aproximamos al pórtico de la gloria, problema. Bien, sabéis todos y todas sobre la restauración que ha tenido lugar durante tanto tiempo. Esta sería una de las propuestas que se harían, ¿vale? Fijémonos en la distribución, ¿vale?, de arquitectónica, donde fijaos cómo todo el espacio es la gloria, es el orden, es el orden, ¿vale? Sin embargo, ese ámbito del infierno o del purgatorio nos da igual porque nos sirve como imagen moral para el fiel. Alude bien a este espacio en el arco derecha, que parece como que está relegando, ¿no?, ese discurso que se ha querido hacer, pero se quiere recordar al individuo, ¿no? Que es al final y al cabo al quien se está dirigiendo moralmente. Bien, tras los estudios de la restauración, lo que se menciona es que, aunque quede muy poco de los pigmentos, se han encontrado pigmentos tierra y oscuros, ¿vale? Que no eran nada puros. Se hizo esta recreación con lo poco que se encontró, pero ya nos estamos encontrando pigmentos oscuros, ¿vale? Estamos hablando, ¿vale?, de una transición de ese lenguaje artístico románico simbólico a el naturalismo incipiente gótico, ¿vale? Fijaos cómo ya se empieza a notar esa polarización. La portada del juicio final de Tudela, aunque no conservemos color, aquí la fotógrafa Blanca Aldanondo y el periodista Diego Carasusán proponían esta recreación, ¿vale?, en base a otras portadas. No se ha conservado realmente nada de la policromía, pero sí que es verdad que a la hora de ver la distribución en este lado, uno de los lados, la narratividad de los infiernos, en el cual ya se ven escenas muy desarrolladas, donde hay diablos que hacen todas las fechorías, y en el lado izquierdo, bueno, al revés, entendemos, ¿no?, en el relato cristiano, los cielos, sí que realmente, aunque yo no propondría ese tipo de colores, esos tonos, se ve que por la distribución, ¿no?, al haber una polarización ya de estos espacios tan marcada y que además ocupan tanto espacio. Bien, para ir terminando, que ya creo que voy un poco mal de tiempo, la portada de la Majestad de Toro, me imagino que no tantos lo conoceréis. Bueno, debido a los criterios de restauración, en este caso, que tuvo lugar en los 90, se retira todas las capas posteriores y se deja la capa original. Bien para los medievalistas, pero el resto de capas pues se pierden. En el lado de la izquierda tendríamos lo que se encontraba en los 90 y posteriormente colores vivos, planos, ¿no? La capa original, ¿vale?, del medievo. ¿Qué es lo que ocurre cuando nos acercamos a los infiernos de Toro? Fijaos, es que aquí no se ve. ¿Veis la flechita? Bien. Cuando leemos la última banda, que es donde se encuentran los cielos y los infiernos, si bien Cristo está presidiendo en el medio, vemos cómo estos espacios ya tienen un desarrollo, una construcción, una imagen, ¿no?, una estética particular, que además no siguen el lenguaje gótico, ¿vale?, a través de esas dovelas, sino que ambos tienen una expresividad, una visualidad que las representa, y en ellos se puede admirar estas representaciones. Estamos en el lado de los infiernos y vemos una procesión, ¿vale?, la cual se acompaña con un fondo rojo, con unos demonios que ya los colores que predominan en ellos son marrones, oscuros, negros y rojos. Y fijaos, cuando llegamos a la puerta de los infiernos, ¿vale?, nos encontramos con el mismo Satanás presidiendo en colores rojo y negro. También es uno de las expresiones del simbolismo, esa bicromía. Y al traspasar esa puerta, encontramos el fondo absolutamente negro. Ya hay una polarización, una oposición, una contraposición de estos espacios. Bien, conclusiones, y ya termino. Leo rápidamente. El color nos sirve como índice y alude a las ideologías. A partir de estas nuevas consideraciones de los siglos XII y XIII y estos cambios, se pueden ir a través del color también persiguiendo y siguiendo estas ideas que tendrían los medievales. Habría una codificación cromática nueva que se comienza a reformular, ¿vale?, y nos vamos acercando a una aproximación más humana del bien y el mal. Ese uso del color también es expresivo y nos indica esa polarización. Recordamos ese sistema de oposiciones que también nos está aludiendo a una creación de ambos espacios, de ambas imágenes, y esa aproximación más naturalista del arte, hacia analogías que encontramos en los elementos naturales y con ello también cómo nos vamos alejando de ese simbolismo que encontramos en los demonios para ir acercándonos a más bien una codificación de seres infernales que posteriormente adquirirán esos tonos verdes y rojos tan característicos que están en nuestro imaginario cultural. Muchas gracias por esa atención.
We are going to listen now to Timothy Hunter from the Magdalen College of Oxford with the communication clerical and chivalric attitudes to colors from the 12th to the 14th centuries, codification, proliferation, and symbolism.
Thank you very much for that. I realise I've probably bitten off slightly more than I can chew in this short presentation, so I'm going to confine myself to some aspects of clerical and chivalric attitudes to colour. And what we need to do at the very beginning is to make a distinction between in terms of clerical attitudes to colour, between the so-called regular clergy, that is, people who were in an order, in a religious, institution such as a monastery or a nunnery, or among, such as monks and nuns and friars, and the secular clergy. So we're talking about their priests, deacons, bishops, and so on and so forth. And I'm showing you here 3 images from different periods that show that distinction. On the left-hand side, you see a group of Dominican friars with their distinctive white and black clothes, the white robe, and they, over the top of that they wear this black cape and hood. And the artist, in this case the master of the Dominican effigies, has given them all these red books to offset this very austere colour combination. On the right-hand side we have Cistercian monks, and Cistercians wore white clothes, and here the artist, this is a Cistercian gradual illuminated manuscript, and the artist has in fact left the actual white robes unadorned. I mean, he hasn't even painted them in white, and in fact that's quite accurate because Cistercians wore undyed clothes, probably slightly greyer than actual white. And in the middle we have one of Taddeo Gaddi's Santa Croce sacristy panels, and you see there St. Francis before the Pope. In this case it's Pope Innocent III, and we're going to come back to him in a little bit. And obviously in Holly's talk we saw some rather fantastic images of Franciscan friars, and they wear their distinctive brown, greyish brown clothes. In fact, the order of St. Francis didn't actually stipulate what colour the robe should be, just that they should be humble. But it became, and no doubt early Franciscans were given clothes out of charity, but the brown colour tended to stick, and so we normally see Franciscans depicted in brown. And the contrast here is particularly striking because the Pope and his two cardinals sitting either side of the Pope are rather resplendent. In the Pope in his red robes, and the 2 cardinals, one in blue, deep blue, the other in white, with their red cardinals' hats. You see here a very visual distinction between the very austere, sombre colours of the regular clergy compared to the rather extravagant clothing that we see among the secular clergy, certainly the higher ranking secular clergy. And you see something of this here again in a depiction of the consecration of Cluny in 1095. This is when Cluny was rebuilt. And Urban II, the Pope, came to Cluny to consecrate this huge, remarkable abbey. And on the right, you see the Benedictine monks. They wore a black habit. Here it looks a bit sort of greyish blue, probably no doubt faded slightly. Whereas the bishops and the Pope on the left-hand side, again wearing very colourful outfits, which sort of brings it home to you. Now, how were the secular clergy depicted in art of this sort of general period? I'm going to show you a few choice illustrations from various fantastic manuscripts. On the left here we have the benedictional St. Ethelwald, one of the great Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, and inside the arch we have St. Swithin, who is an early bishop of Winchester, and St. Swithin is depicted wearing a very rich, almost regal outfit. He's got gold robes decorated in gold leaf, which was used by the artists who worked on this manuscript. Great liberal use of gold leaf and throughout the whole manuscript. And above that he's wearing a chasuble of blue with sort of highlighted in white, and his pallium is also in gold. So extremely rich clothing. On the right-hand side we have a very typical Romanesque image of, this is of Pope Gregory, St. Gregory the Great. It's from a French mid-12th century manuscript of Gregory the Great's letters. And here Gregory is depicted wearing a very ornate chasuble, which is blue, but also with a red and white highlights that seem to sort of suffuse the whole garment, over a green, blue, and even white undergarments with a red, seems to be sort of embroidered pallium. So very, very rich, intricately coloured clothing. Other colour combinations were also possible. This is a wonderful double-page spread from the Egbert Psalter, the great Ottonian 10th century manuscript. And we see here one of the early bishops of Trier, St. Valerius, and he's wearing a wonderful mixture of colours. He's wearing a sort of purple chasuble over a green, blue undergarments with red lining, so very, very intricate colour combinations. This manuscript depicts many early bishops of Trier against the opposite the Psalms, and they're all dressed in this sort of, very sort of ornate way. Now, you might say, well, it's all very well looking at rich, elaborate manuscript illumination, but is this a reliable source for the sort of things that bishops were wearing? And no doubt the illustrators and illuminators of these manuscripts did take some poetic license in their depictions of these wonderful, wonderful bishops. And it's very difficult for us to know for sure, because obviously textiles are extremely fragile and they don't survive. So we have very few actual surviving textiles from this period to determine whether these colour combinations were real or not. But we do have a description, and I'm showing you here an interesting illustration from Bede's Life of St. Cuthbert. And Cuthbert was a 7th century bishop of Lindisfarne, and after he died, his shrine had to be moved on several occasions because of Viking incursions and what have you, and it was finally interred in Durham Cathedral. And this illustration is one of those interments. And in 1104 was the final time that Cuthbert's body was opened. The tomb was opened up. Of course, Cuthbert was miraculously intact, and he was transferred to his final resting place, or at least until the Reformation. And a monk of Durham, a man called Reginald, gives us a description of the clothing that was found in the tomb on the bishop. And it's a fascinating description of clothing, because although Reginald is writing at a slightly later period, it does seem to be from an eyewitness account of the actual clothing that Cuthbert was wearing. And he takes great pains to try and explain the colours in this clothing. He describes a particularly richly ornate dalmatic that Cuthbert was wearing, which he describes as a reddish-purple colour. But in addition to that, there was another colour that had been woven into the material, a bit like we saw with the image of Gregory earlier. And this colour was citrinus, lemon colour, yellow. And in describing this, Reginald seems to be very, very sensitive to the colour combination, because he says at some length that this mixture of the citron colour, the yellow colour, with the purple reddish colour of the material created an even stronger effect, and it was even more brilliant because of this colour combination. And that was an actual textile that survived and was known in the early 12th century from Cuthbert's tomb. We don't know if it was original to Cuthbert himself. It might have been added slightly later, or even in the 12th century. But nevertheless, that's an early witness account of the actual clothing of a medieval bishop. Now, when it comes to the colours that were worn in this period up until the 12th century, there does seem to be really no order or standard that was followed in different dioceses throughout Christendom. The Bible was of little use when it came to actually stipulating which colours priests should wear. There was a passage in Exodus when God gives Moses some quite detailed accounts of how the tabernacle should be decorated and what the priests should wear, starting with Moses' brother Aaron. And the colours that are mentioned there in the Bible, in the Vulgate version, are hyacintho, which is sometimes translated as blue, but could also, I guess, be violet, purpura, which normally is translated as purple, cocoa, which is red or crimson, and then the other colour that is generally assumed to be used was white, and that comes from the bisurritota, the twisted linen. So the Levitical colours, as they're sometimes known, were four. They were hyacintho, purpura, cocoa, and a type of white. And indeed, some writers, such as Bede, did recommend that if these colours were good enough for God telling Moses how it should be in Exodus, then those are the colours that the Christian church should follow. But there was never really a agreement on this, and it seems that individual bishops in dioceses throughout Europe went their own way and used whatever colours they wanted. Now, it wasn't until the late 12th century that Innocent III, or as he was then, Cardinal Lothar of Dossegny, tried to bring some order to this riot of colour among the secular clergy when he wrote his famous treatise that I know that Angel had spoken about earlier this morning, De Alturis Mysterio. And he lists four colours, like the Levitical colours, but he lists slightly different colours. So we have albus, white, which is used for Easter, very Christ-centric festivals. Nativity, obviously, Ascension, All Saints' Day, etc. White was a fairly uncontroversial colour in the liturgy. Rubeus was another colour that he gave sanction to. This is obviously red, and red for Innocent represented the blood spilt by Christ and for Christ, for the martyrs. So red was appropriate for apostles and for martyrs, and also for Pentecost. Nigris, black, was also another uncontroversial colour that he recommended. and black was used for penitence and fasting, so Lent would have been, we're in Lent now, of course. If I was addressing a council of medieval bishops, I'd expect you to be wearing black today. Instead, I see various combinations of blue, red, and yellow, which is rather pleasant to see. So black was a very uncontroversial colour. Green, though, viridis, was the unusual addition to Innocent's or to Lothar's combination of 4 colours. Why he included green? Well, he doesn't stipulate it. It's not particularly a biblical colour, although he does quote from the Song of Songs on this issue. But he says that green is the median colour, colour medius est, between the 3 other colours that he was talking about. Now, where he gets this idea from is a good question. It may have been, he may be borrowing from classical ideas of colour theory, but it's hard to know exactly the authority that he's using. Now, in the short time that remains, I'm going to say something a little bit about chivalric colour, because we see a similar kind of ordering that takes place in the late 12th, early 13th century that came about with liturgical colours. And I was wondering, what sort of classical colour theory Lothar was looking at, but maybe he was looking at Romance as well, because there's a famous passage in Cligès, the Romance of Chrétien de Troyes, where Cligès adopts 4 different colours in a tournament, and the colours he adopts are exactly the liturgical colours of black, green, red, and white, and he uses them in that order. And although, Cligès was written in the 1170s, slightly earlier than Lothar's treatise, which was from the 1190s, but there is a sort of crossover with clerical and chivalric attitudes to colour. And I'm going to finish with the great ordering system of colour in chivalric context, which of course is heraldry. And this also takes place during the 12th century. By the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century, we have, what we would now recognize as sort of the beginnings of classic blazon in the types of color combinations that were permitted within coats of arms. And of course, the colors were limited, again, just like they were in liturgical colors, although again, slightly different colors. In heraldry, we have gulls, red, sable, black, azure, blue, vert, or sinople, as it became known as green. Later, purple was also admitted, but not at the beginning. And those were to be mixed. They couldn't be mixed among themselves, but the rules of heraldry state that they could be mixed with the two metals, or an argent, and also with furs, vert and ermine. And what's obvious about the language of heraldry is that it is a language of wealth and material value, because these are terms largely derived from exotic and rich textiles, such as gulls, sable, vert and ermine, as well as expensive minerals, azure from azurite, which we've heard about yesterday. Purpure was obviously had classical and imperial connotations. Vert was the sort of odd one out. Vert was a simple green, but even vert became sinople, and sinople alludes to a seaport on the Black Sea where expensive dyes and pigments were traded. A very exotic term. So heraldry, so in conclusion then, I want to just sort of point to the fact that the turning point for this systemization and categorization of colour into codes takes place really sometime in the late 12th, early 13th century. And although, the clerical ecclesiastical context was very different from the chivalric context, actually they share some of the same combinations and same sort of need for codification in this period. So, of course, as in so many different ways one can show, but the clerical world and the ecclesiastical world were not as separate as sometimes we like to think they are. They're much more interrelated. And on that note, I'm going to stop, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. To finish, we are going to listen to Zoriana Lotu, who is an independent research with the communication Seeing and Understanding Medieval Blue.
Thank you. So we'll speak about Middle English color terms for blue, and this will be illustrated by examples from Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. I started analyzing blue color terms in this text by calculating the color words and creating this chart. And on the first side, it looks like the general prologue and entire text of the Canterbury Tales shows a clear tendency towards the predominance of red, white, and black. However, at a closer look, we can notice that things are not as simple as that. So, for the blue color terms in the Canterbury Tales, we can single out the following synonyms or color terms. Blue, this is just one of the spelling versions of that word: azure, hearse, vachet, and sapphire. And you can also see the proportion of the above-mentioned color terms for blue. The following is the list of the 4 descriptions of blue-colored garments of the 4 different characters in the Canterbury Tales. Purse is often referred to blue wool, dyed with woad, so it's not silk and not indigo. It was one of the most highly esteemed blue clothes. The color term purse is dubious on various levels. The origin of this word was not agreed upon until today. Vachet textiles were found in wardrobes of both nobility and monarchs. From this, we can conclude that this color term describes the expensive colored fabric. Of course, the value depended on the type of textile, whether it was silk or wool. However, generally, the elite interest in blue is the choice of a very dark and intense blue. The more saturated the fabric, the better and the more valuable it was. Blue-colored textiles in medieval Europe were obtained from woad dyeing. Here is a table of all known blue pigments and dyes, which I classified in the chronological order for convenience. And that plant, called Isatis tinctoria in Latin, was cultivated on the entire European continent and other parts of the world since ancient times. As this is a natural organic dye stuff, the saturation of color dependent on the number of dippings of the textile in the dye, as well as the type of fabric. Therefore, one and the same medieval color term, especially those related to dye stuff, in practice resulted in a number of hues. So, for example, if we take that above-mentioned term purse, it is sometimes described as purplish blue, sometimes as dark intense blue. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, it's dark blue, bluish gray, and in later periods, it's purplish black. It can also signify pinkish, reddish, shades, or the color of rust. So basically, depending, according to different sources, the shade of color described by the word purse varies from light blue to almost dark red, and sometimes it is unclear if the word purse describes the color at all or simply the fabric. There is also little certainty as to the hue of vachet, as it is often described as light blue and sometimes as greenish blue. Similarly, we cannot be sure of the hue described by the term blue. This term is used in descriptions of all sorts of blue-colored objects like flowers, pigments, dyes, animal fabrics, skin or complexion affected by a blow or severe cold. And the term was occasionally used to describe paleness and discoloration, in which case the best translation would be livid. Apart from the huge amount of spelling versions, there is also confusion and uncertainty concerning the etymology of the term blue. We don't know if it's from Latin blavus, or is it from Indo-European blevo, the Germanic blevas, Old French blau or bleu, or is it from Old Norse blar, meaning livid? We can be more or less certain about the hue of azure, the saturated bright warm blue, and this certainly arises from the fact that it is one of the heraldic chromatic codes. So, on one occasion, Chaucer used azure in the description of the wedding gift of a woman that showed a lot of nobility in her behavior. On another occasion, it was used in the colorful description of the chanticleer, the rooster, in the nun's priest's tale. It was suggested by some researchers that chanticleer's colors allude to the heraldic codes of Henry Bolingbroke, the Duke of Hereford, which you can see that coat of arms. This seems like a reasonable conclusion, as in the Chaucer's literary works, the word azure is always followed by the word gold, always accompanied by this word gold, which is a typical heraldic color opponency of azure. Of course, the major tendency of the Middle English color terms is that hue is not the criterion for the categorization of medieval color terms. The first reason lies in the materiality of color, because all pigments and dyes are organic at the time, and hence their hue is very rarely stable. This is especially the case of dye stuff, and I quote, "Favorite dye of the Germanic peoples was produced by crushing blackberries, and the broad range of color covered by this term thus represents a specialized dye term. This is significant that it is only Old English and regularly applied only to fabrics and occurs as a substantive, meaning purple clothes. And similarly is Old English wedden, meaning purple blue. It is regularly applied only to fabrics, and being etymologically related to woad, refers to dye from that plant," unquote. And similarly, blue pigments available to medieval artists also show instability and thus uncertainty about their hue. So, for example, azurite-based pigments were prone to either greening or darkening, and even the ultramarine blue, which was one of the most reliable blue pigments in history, was known to suffer from the so-called ultramarine sickness. And secondly, medieval color terms are often categorized according to the appearance, visual qualities of the colored surface, like reflectivity and the saturation or intensity. The example of the color term brun is one of such terms, and I quote again, "Brun stands for well-polished metal surfaces, helmet, sword edge, waves of the sea, feathers of the phoenix, and an Ethiopian person," unquote. So one thing that all these objects and people have in common is glistening or sparkling appearance, and not brown color as this term is often translated. Thirdly, medieval colors show quite an obvious tendency to be classed based on the lightness-darkness axis, which was, of course, mentioned already. Here is another quotation. "Beowulf is a poem of bright day and darkest night, light ale-hole and gloomy wasteland. That this has a symbolic load is evident. Let it be noted also that black is far and away the most common color in Old English poetry," unquote. So this lightness-darkness axis, in the context of medieval notion of light, the lux and lumen, obtains an extra dimension. Isidore of Seville speaks of the inner light or lumen, or sometimes the inner heat. In his etymologies, several substances are mentioned as either having inner heat or being capable of revealing heat once touched, squeezed, or rubbed. Some of these examples are quite comprehensible to the from the contemporary perspective, like the description of the pyrites that, quote, give off sparkles, unquote, and again, quote, burn the hand of anyone holding it tightly, unquote. Others are quite surprising, like the purplish or violet amethyst is described to be able to, quote, gently give out a sort of little flame, unquote. So, to sum it up, the largest category for medieval color terms can be lightness-darkness opposition. This, of course, can be connected with the theological and philosophical notions of lux, lumen, widespread in the Middle Ages. Within this large category, we can single out two big subcategories of internal and external light or heat. So according to Umberto Eco, medieval chromatic tastes were characterized by immediacy and simplicity, and attempts were made to obtain the maximum intensity of color with that of light that passes through and floods it. And he provides an example of stained glasses of Gothic cathedral as the best manifestation of this idea. And another example of the colored appearance, which involves external light interaction, is, for example, sapphire in the case of blue, which both reflects light and lets it through due to its semi-transparency. Finally, the internal light. Probably the best example is saturation, in which case the intensity of the dyed fabric can be a good example. Several surveys conducted in the recent decades show that blue color is either the color of preference in the Occident or is among the favorite colors. However, of course, it is not mentioned if it is dark or light blue, or if the preferred blue is the blue of the summer sky or that of the uniform. And similarly, many of the contemporary sources about color are classified based on hue. Just as my initial idea of color statistics in the Middle English literary texts, which I was following this view of colors as hues. So while today color is hue, in the previous historic periods it was, I quote, learner, complex sensation, and color words were appearance words. On the other hand, while hue color terms are often connected with prismatic colors, thus with the Newton's theory, they actually started to appear as early as late Middle Ages. The color term blue has many features of a hue term. In his usage, we can notice that there is no connection to dye stuff, even though clothes can be described blue in Middle English, as you could see in the quotations. And there is no connection to either light, internal, external, reference, and no reference to reflectivity of a certain surface or its saturation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all. We have some minutes if there is any question.
Actually, I would like to make a little comment.
Oh, yes, okay.
Because we started yesterday we started with a very interesting question about whether some color terms in the medieval Europe. So I'd like to ask Professor Petzold, what do you think about chromatic codes of heraldry? Because they were known, I suppose, in the entire medieval Europe. They had a very they had a system of color words which corresponded to a specific color hue. Were they, can we say that they were universal, more or less, in medieval Europe?
Right. I think we need to refer to some of the work of Burnham and Kay, the idea of basic colour terms. You need to distinguish between basic colour terms and colour terms which have concrete reference. You got okay? And in terms of blue, because Michel Castro talks about this book, is quite controversial, in many ways, very critical. It's not really until the 12th century that we think that we get the emergence of what's starting to return to as a basic colour term for blue, which is first started in Old French and German blood. That's an abstract colour term, as opposed to a colour term, a bluish colour term. And I think there is a distinction. So in the earlier period, you do get terms that refer to bluish colours, but not the idea of abstract blue colour. Okay? And I think from what I'm reading, the more linguistic theory of their work is very important, that from what I see that chapter in this book I contributed to History of Colour, there's a very good chapter on linguistics and language, and what one of the he says that as we go to the later Middle Ages, hue becomes much more important. Whereas certainly the lighter, in the early Middle Ages, the light darkness particularly is much more important. So really, when we're looking at colour, we're looking at we can't just think of Middle Ages as a big, massive, homogeneous block. We're looking at developments within language. And a crucial role is played by the emergence of vernacular languages, as opposed to Latin and Greek. But even within medieval Latin, on seeing there is development. Okay? But it's a very difficult, particularly in the case of blue, it is I think very, very difficult. But as I say, I believe it tends to be Castro's work has been criticised, I think, rather unjustifiably, but if he'd been more cautious, he wouldn't have been criticised to that degree. But I think he's roughly correct in designing this blue revolution, which emerges, he says, very much in the 13th, I think more in the 12th century. I think the other slight problem I have is that his work has a very much a Francophile orientation. And it would be interesting to, for example, to look at blue in the context of Spanish art, the artist manuscripts, and also, for example, in something like the work of the German, the Holy Roman Empire. So I don't know. That's my views anyway.
Okay, thank you.
But as I say, I think John Gage, who I knew, it was a very brilliant article he wrote. But I think he went too far, and I think a lot of this needs to be worked out in more greater detail. And I think you've got to be very careful about having big, broad, blunt generalizations. But yes, it's blue. Blue is very, very interesting, I think.
Yes, it is.
Particularly, I think, yes, it's fascinating. And of course, the whole connection with textiles and fabrics and dyeing and so on, which is very, very interesting. Yeah.
Creo que había una pregunta. Ah, sí.
Perfect. Now, yeah. Well, thank you for to all the speakers. But my question is to Holly. It was mind-blowing to find this use of the lead white in Assisi, and in my field where I study some mural paintings in Navarre, in rural churches, I also find a lot of white lead used, especially in the skins, and almost all the figures have turned into black, no? But there is a massive use of white lead also. And it's especially interesting because besides of knowing, because Cennini, he warns of the use of black-white, so they knew that it was going to turn to black maybe in a century or something like that, no? So, but besides of that, it was extremely toxic also. So using lead white in painting could result in deaths of the painters. So it was really, really compelling, no, to find, to hear your paper. And my question is, do you think that in the Duecento or in the Trecento, other Italian painters, they use the lead white with that very specific symbolic use? Thank you.
Is this on? Maybe not. I don't know if this is on either. No. Nope. Is there a way to turn these on? Oh, okay, something is on. All right. Okay, great. Wonderful to hear about your research. And I think, as I pointed out, the Maestro di San Francesco, who also used lead white, and I think Cimabue must have learned it from someone. And I think that technically, it does create this brighter white. And I was able to really think a lot about Cimabue and how he might have thought about this material differently in a symbolic way. And I think probably I haven't done a very close visual analysis of the lead white, for example, in the lower church that the Maestro di San Francesco uses, but my guess is that we would find some similar kind of symbolic, kind of selective use of it. For example, when we see it on the use of the dead Christ that I showed briefly, or on the angels, I think that it's very possible that we would see the same sort of thing in other works as well, but Cimabue is where I've kept my ideas so far. So, and just also to your point, about the idea of, this ephemerality of the material, it's impossible to know whether this was on the minds of any artist, but I do wonder how long, were they thinking about longer term, did they want this to last for 100 years, or did they think the apocalypse was coming? And so it didn't matter because we'd all be looking at, the shining walls of heaven instead, so.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Vale, pues entonces vamos ahora al descanso y volvemos a las 6:30. Gracias.